So one of Blender's coolest built-in features is its fluid simulation. The ability to generate mesh fluid is just super cool to me, and one of my favorite features. So in this beginner tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at how to simulate realistic fluid. Okay, so all of our fluid is going to be taking place inside of the default cube. It is going to be the domain object, they call it, for the fluid simulation, and all of our fluid will be contained inside of the cube. So we don't have to delete this. In fact, we're going to scale it up just a little bit. I'm going to hit S on my keyboard and then 2 to make it just a little bigger and easier to work around. And then I'm going to delete my default lamp here because I don't need it. And I'm going to switch from Blender Render to Cycles Render because we'll be rendering the fluid in cycles. Alright, now we can hit 3 on our number pad to jump to right view, hit 5 to go to orthographic. I'm just going to right click to select my cube, tab into edit mode, and then holding control, drag it up 2 notches so it's sitting along the green bar there, and it's on top of our grid floor. I can tab now out of edit mode, and this is the box for our fluid to be contained in. It doesn't have to be so tall. The smaller you can make the box, the more detail you can keep in your fluid. So I'm going to scale it along the Z downwards to about, oh, it doesn't really matter, something around there is going to be good for our fluid simulation. Now I'm going to hit Z to make it a wireframe view, and I'm going to duplicate this cube to give ourselves an obstacle for the fluid to land in. We could just have it land inside the cube, but it's kind of cool to have it reacting off of a little bit of a shape, or an object you could call it, in the scene. So that's going to be kind of a square bowl, kind of sink type thing you can imagine. But I'm just going to be using a square bowl. You could use like a circle bowl or something. I'm just going to go with a square shape like you saw in my animation. So I'm just going to hit Shift D to duplicate this cube. And then I'm going to left click and scale it down just a little bit. It doesn't really have to be scaled down much, but I'm going to scale it down along the Z now. So S and Z to pull it down to be just about so high. And then I'm going to raise it up just a little bit too so it's not quite touching the domain object. Alright. So I'm going to pan up now, and you can see it's just a solid cube. I'm going to tab into edit mode, select face select mode here, grab that top face, I'm going to E to extrude, and then S and shift to slowly scale inwards just a bit. It doesn't have to be a thick glass bowl, or a glass sink, whatever you want to call it. And now I'm going to hit E one more time, and drag it downwards to be just about to the bottom, but not quite. Alright, you can kind of play with that a little bit. Now hitting tab and Z, if I hit 5, I can kind of get inside this cube, and we can see that we have our glass box inside that cube. Alright, so I'm going to hit 5 to get out of perspective view, and we're ready to add in our fluid obstacle. So we need an obstacle to be constantly adding our water to the scene. And for this, I'm just going to use a circle. So I'm going to hit Z again so I can see through my mesh here. I'm going to place my, my faucet, you could call it, up in the corner here. I'm going to hit Shift A, add in a circle, and then I'm going to fill it just with a triangle fan for now. That's all we really need. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees by hitting R and 90 on my number pad, and then I'll scale it down just to be about something like that. That's all you really need. Cool. I don't have to remove it. And this is going to be our outflow, or our inflow. I forget which one it's called, but basically the fluid that is constantly being added to our scene. Alright, so let's set up some fluid settings now. So I'm going to grab our domain object there, click on physics, and I'm going to click fluid. Now we have a fluid type. This is going to be our domain. So I'm going to go ahead and choose domain. And before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and set up my other fluid obstacles, which is going to be our bowl. So I'm going to right click that and click fluid as well. And this will be our obstacle. And then I'm going to select that circle we made, and this is going to be the fluid type inflow. Now if you hover over inflow, you can see it says object adds fluid to the simulation, and that's exactly what we want. But we don't want it to just be dropping. We want it to be kind of shooting out. So I'm going to take the inflow velocity and move it along the x-axis here. If you grab G and X, you can see this is the x-axis. And I'm going to have it kind of shoot out here at about a 0.8. So it's shooting not a whole 1, but about a 0.8 down to about right there. And that will be perfect. It'll be kind of shooting the fluid out and down onto our floor. I can also raise this up just a little bit, stick it up in the corner a little bit more. And perfect. Okay, so back to our object settings now. Let's grab our bowl, and I want to change the slip type to be no slip. This is basically, the slip type is going to mean how much the fluid kind of sticks to the surface, and I really don't want it to stick at all. I find if it sticks much at all, it kind of looks like a gelatin almost. And on this surface, which is going to be glass, I just want it to slide with no slipping. So I'm going to choose no slip, and then I'm going to choose both for the volume initialization. I find this gives the best results for not letting fluid pass through your object. So go ahead and do that. And then we are ready to set our domain object settings. So go ahead and right click your domain object here, and we're going to set up some fluid settings. So first off is the time. This is going to be the length of your simulation in seconds. So you have to look at what your frame rate currently is on your scene. You can see this by going to your camera settings and your frame rate. I'm going to go ahead and change this to be 30 FPS. My final animation was actually 60 FPS, but I'm just going to render 30 for this. And I think I'll go 4 frames. So 4 frames would be 30 times 4, which is 120. So I can change my timeline here to be just 120 frames. And then in my fluid settings here, back in the physics tab, I can set this to be 4, which it already is. So just make sure it's still set to 4, which is going to be 4 seconds of simulated fluid. And that's going to be perfect. Okay, so now going down to our fluid world settings, this is the size of the fluid. So basically this is going to be telling Blender what the size of your cube should be in real world size to the fluid. So basically if you're doing like a pool, you'd probably want this to be like 10 meters, but if you're doing like a coffee cup, you'd probably want it to be 0.05 meters. For kind of a sink slash bowl, 0.5 meters is actually pretty good. It's about a foot and a half, which is about the average size of a sink or something. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Doesn't really have to be changed. Maybe slightly smaller, but you could pretty much leave it at 0.5. I'll go 0.4. The fluid presets, we want to make sure it's still set to water, which is the default, and that's what we're simulating. If you're doing something like oil or honey, you could try one of those. And then the fluid boundary, I'm also going to change this to be no slip. And then we have some surface settings here. Now I like to increase the smoothing quite a bit, otherwise you end up with some kind of jagged edges sometimes on your fluid that doesn't really look realistic. So I kind of like to smooth the fluid down a bit, and I'm going to set this to about a 1.6. Now the subdivisions, you kind of need to do this to give better smoothing and to be able to add some particles to your fluid. So I'm going to go ahead and give it 2 subdivisions. You need at least 2 if you're going to be adding some particles, which is the last setting we'll be changing right here. So the fluid particles, this is easy to go way too much on. For something like a faucet, we only want a very small amount, so I'm going to go 0.005. If you're doing something like a hose sprayer head or something, you could increase this a bit to get a lot more particles in your scene, but 0.005 is pretty good for just a few particles like you would have from a faucet. Okay, now we want to set a destination for our fluid cache. This is going to be where it caches all of the information from your domain bake, basically your fluid simulation. And it can sometimes be a fairly large size. So make sure you have at least a few gigabytes of space on your hard drive if you're doing some bigger simulations, sometimes even more. And go ahead and set the destination of that folder there. Okay, now we have 2 resolutions here. One is preview and one is final. The preview is baked just so you can kind of play your simulation back at full speed, because once you have a high quality rendered fluid, you won't be able to play it at full speed. We're going to just leave this at the default settings for now to make sure we're getting the right sort of animation before we increase this to a very high amount to get a realistic result. The simulation threads, you can leave that at 0. And yeah, let's go ahead and save our scene before we bake. And let's bake to see what we're getting right out of the box. So if I hit play now, we can see that our first little bit of fluid is being simulated here. And yeah, it's looking pretty good. It's kind of just puddling up there and adding to the scene. And it looks like it's colliding with our domain object and not going through it at all. Our object, I'm sorry, not our domain. And it's looking pretty decent. I'm thinking that we can go ahead and add in a higher quality. But before I do that, let's just wait for this to finish up here. I can change our viewport display over to our final and see what it looks like at a little higher quality. Alright, so that is just about wrapping up there. Alright, we're finished. Now if I change this to final, you can see that we get a higher quality version. And we're seeing what the final version looks like. And it's looking pretty good. Maybe we could add even more fluid if we wanted to by scaling this up a little bit, and it's going to be even more fluid added to your scene. And if you want to get creative, you could add some more obstacles in here, like another dish or something to be splashing off of and get some really cool results. But for this, I'm just going to be doing the basic. Keep in mind that the more obstacles you add, the longer it will take to simulate your fluid. But I think we're ready for a higher quality fluid. So I'm going to go ahead and select our fluid object here again. Once you start baking, your domain cube turns into the fluid. So just keep that in mind. You want to select your fluid when you want to change the settings and rebake. And I'm going to give it a resolution of 165. Now you can see here that the memory that's going to be needed is 262 megabytes now. So keep in mind you're going to need more memory for the higher quality resolutions. And this will probably take about 20 minutes or so to bake. But I'm ready to bake. So I'm going to go ahead and save our file one more time, and let's bake out the high quality version. Okay, so here's our final high quality bake. If we switch the viewport display from preview over to final here, you can see our high quality fluid. And then if we select the fluid and choose smooth shading in our toolbar here, we can smooth that out and make it look a bit nicer as well. So now if I scrub through my timeline, we can see we have those few particles that we added, adding a little bit of extra realism, and yeah, it looks pretty nice. You could almost make the flow even larger if you wanted, and maybe shooting out a little bit more if you wanted as well too, by increasing the, let me select that there, increasing the velocity. But this is pretty good. Bowl, square, cube, whatever we want to call it. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead now and set up a material here. I'm going to split my window by grabbing the corner there and dragging it over. Go to my node editor, and here I'm going to hit N to close the properties tab, select the fluid, and then click new material. Actually, we already have a material here, so I can just go over to the materials here and click use nodes. We'll see a nodes pop up here, and I just need to delete that diffuse node and shift A, add in the glass node. Alright. So the glass node is going to be how we get our realistic water. If we plug that into the surface, make the color, it's already 100%, but make sure it's 100%, and then change the IOR value to 1.33, which is the IOR value of water, leaving the roughness at 0. And if we go rendered now, we should see what looks like water. Awesome. We need kind of a background now to give it some reflections. So I'm going to go ahead now and open an environment map. This environment map is from HDR Haven, and I'll include a link in the description, but you can download that for free. And we're just going to click Use Nodes, grab that button there, and choose Environment Texture, and go ahead and open up this environment balcony. I'm going to just use the 8K for this, and click Open Image. And now I'm going to change my node type from the material nodes to the environment nodes here. And we can see this is where our environment texture is. And if I go rendered, let me quick switch to GPU compute, so it goes a little faster. And if I go rendered, we should have, waiting for that loading. Okay, we have an environment set up. And you can see our fluid looks quite a bit better now that it's more visible. So I'm going to go ahead and snap my camera to this view by selecting the camera right here in our inspector there, zooming in a little bit, and then going Alt-Control-0. I'll just snap the camera to that view. And I'm just going to grab the camera and pull it back. Whoops, I don't have the camera selected there. Grab the camera up there and hit G and the middle mouse wheel to just kind of zoom out. Perfect. We can kind of drop it in here, rotate a little bit, zoom out a little bit more by hitting G and the middle mouse wheel. And now I just kind of want to zoom in so it's a little bit more of a zoomed in shot here. Something like that looks okay. And then we need to scale up our floor a little bit so we don't have any of that environment map in the shot. Alright, so let's go ahead and quick give that floor a material before we tweak this environment texture. I'm just going to click the material nodes there, grab the floor plane, click new material, and then this is just going to be, I'm going to go ahead and hit X on that diffuse. It's just going to be a glossy. So I'm going to choose glossy, drop it in there, and then turn the roughness way down to be something like a 0.006. So we just have kind of those blurry reflections on it, and that looks nice. And that should do it. So now I'm going to tweak our environment map to give it more of the color I'm looking for. Right now it's a little purpley, and I'm not really happy with the positioning of it. So I'm going to go to our environment textures here, zoom out, move around a little bit with the middle mouse wheel, Shift A, add in a texture coordinate node, drag that over there, and then Shift A, add in a vector mapping node. Drop that in the middle, connect the generated to the vector and the vector to the vector. Now we can position with the Z-axis here till we get an angle that we like. I'm thinking somewhere over here is kind of the angle of light that I want. Kind of coming from that side, and that makes the water look real nice and crisp. Somewhere around there. Maybe not quite so far. I like the brightness over here a little bit more. And now I want to change the colors of this image a bit. So to do this, we're going to use the RGB curves. I'm going to go Shift A, add in color, RGB curves, and then drop it in between these two nodes. And now we can kind of change the reds and the greens and the blues to make it a little bit more blue, a little less purpley. So I'm going to take the red value down a bit here. And you can see just doing that gives it kind of a cool look, but still a little bit of purpliness in there. I'm going to go ahead and, take the green, pull that down a bit. That looks a little bit better. Now we still need to take the blue value down just a little bit. All right, and that's looking a little bit more decent. I think maybe the green needs to come down more, maybe less red too. Just kind of tweaking with these colors, and then adding another one to kind of tweak the lows here. And then the highs, just kind of getting a little bit of an S shape, barely there, but slightly visible. All right, tweak the green value a little bit, and then tweak the blue value a little bit like the same. All right, and that looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit too much green still, so I'm going to put that node in there, drag it down, and you can kind of see that that gets rid of the green a little bit more. And that's looking pretty nice. I think maybe the reds are still a little high. Take those out just a little bit more. And all right, now the strength of it is a little high as well. We need to take that down a few ticks, and that's looking a bit better. Now our color is still kind of blown out here. So if you're using the beta version of Blender, you can enable the filmic version, the filmic color management under color management here, view and filmic. I'm currently not using the beta, but I'm going to quick switch over to that actually right now so I can turn that setting on. Okay, so now I switched my Blender version over to the Builder version. I'll put a link into the builder.blender website where you can download the beta builds. But here we can now change the view to filmic. And then you can see right away we get more detail in the shadows, which is awesome and exactly what we want. Go ahead and change the filmic color space to filmic log as well. And yeah, that should do it. Now we can kind of put the strength back up to how it was and maybe just take the exposure down a little bit there to adjust the brightness a little bit. And that's looking a lot better. And yeah, maybe change the angle a little bit more on this. You guys can go ahead and play around with whatever you think looks best. But just panning around the HDR, I found that this kind of angle is what I thought looked the best. And then you can also go ahead and change the Y and Z or X a little bit to get maybe the shadows exactly how you want them in the background here. But I'm just going to tweak that a little bit more. Something like that is looking about okay to me. Doesn't look too bad. Maybe crank the exposure back up just a little bit. All right. And then take the strength down just a few notches. Just kind of finding that middle ground. We see the nice detail and not too much blown out whites. But I think that looks pretty good. Okay, So now a few more render settings before wrapping up this tutorial. Motion blur. Motion blur will add a lot to your realism of your water. It's really hard to get a perfectly sharp image of water, so when you see it perfectly sharp, it almost looks fake. So adding a little bit of motion blur actually adds a lot of realism to the fluid and makes it look better. So in the render settings here, we're going to go down to motion blur right here, check that box, drop it down, and give it a shutter speed of about 0.15. Now, this will increase the render time quite a bit, so beware of that. If you're having a really slow render time, it might be because you have motion blur on, but it really does help the realism. I'm just increasing my tile size here so it renders a little faster for me. And the last thing is some depth of field. So that is also something that will give it a little bit more realism. And we're going to go ahead to our camera settings here, choose limits so we can see where we're focused, and then increase the distance until we have the focus right on the water splash there. And then we're going to take the aperture, change to f-stop, and give it about a 1.2. So, oops, 1.2. So a very shallow depth of field to give it a little bit more of a realistic look. All right, let's see what that looks like. Okay, and that looks pretty good. You can see it's kind of out of focus here, a little bit more out of focus back there. And the water looks nice. You don't see the motion blur until you actually do the final render. But I think I'm about ready. Let's just increase our sample count a little bit more. Where do we have it sampling? Let's give it 256. Should be about right. And I'll go ahead and leave it at a 50% quality. And save and render. All right, I'll be right back with you guys when that's finished. Okay, and there we have it. A few notes. The motion blur, you can see it working, but maybe it could be even a little stronger. And you see a little bit of a collision issue with the water and the glass here. And that can be fixed just by scaling down your box at this point a little bit, your glass obstacle. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this. And looking at the fluid here, I'm just going to scale it holding shift to slowly scale it down until it's about meeting the corner perfectly. Right around there should look pretty decent. And then I'm going to increase the motion blur to be about 0.2, just so we have a little bit more of it. And let's try a different angle on our camera this time, just to get a little bit more in the action of what's going on here. So I'm going to go rotate it, hit Z to get out of wireframe there. And just rotate it around a little bit here, just so we can get a nice view of the water. Zoom in a little bit more. All right. So let's give that a render and see what it's looking like now. Okay, and there we have it. A little bit more motion blur there. Looks nice. And the new angle looks nice as well. So I'm going to quick finish this up with a slight bit of compositing just to give our results a little bit more pop by clicking compositing, use nodes, backdrop. And first I'm going to add just a little bit of color grading to it. So I'm going to add in a color and a color balance node. Drop that in there, and I'm going to change this to offset, power, and slope. And then I'm going to hit Control-Shift, left-click to add in a viewer node. All right, I can hit N to close the Properties tab there. And let's drop this down a little bit because we don't really need it. And I'm going to hit Alt to move the background with the middle mouse wheel there, so we can have that above our nodes here. Okay, now I'm just going to take the power, and I'm going to actually pull it towards the red side, which is going to add more blue to the shadows a bit. And then I'm going to raise it up a little bit to darken. It's kind of weird that it's backwards, but that's just the way it works. To kind of darken the blacks a little bit there. And then I'm going to take this value, the slope, also a little bit warm, just slightly. And then make it a little bit brighter as well. Something like that I think looks pretty nice. Yeah, a little bit of extra color. If you weren't completely happy with your HDR coloring, you can kind of tweak it a little bit at this point. Get something that you're more happy with. I think that looks about decent. And then the last thing I'm going to do is go Shift A, add in a filter glare node. Drop that in here. And you can see right away that it kind of blows out the highlights a little bit by making them glow a little bit. If you change it to fog glow, that's his streaks right now. So change it to fog glow, take the threshold down a little bit, and you can kind of see the glow forming on the highlights. So that looks nice. And if you want to see what it looks like just the glow, you turn the mix to 1, and you can see all the different points of the image that will be glowed. So that looks pretty good. We can change that to high quality for a final render, connect it up to the composite node. And if you're completely happy with the image now, which this looks pretty decent to me, you can pull it up here, open up your image by going rendered result right there, let it load for a sec, and here we'll have our final render that you can go ahead and save out if you so desire. So there you have it. If you're interested in rendering this out as an animation, like I did in the beginning of the video, you can follow the link here on how to render animations, and check out some of my other tutorials as well. Go ahead and get subscribed to the channel, leave a comment on what you thought, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!